December 1st, 1947, Ramenskoye Airfield, outside Moscow. A thin crust of frost clings to the wings of the prototype as the sun drags itself over the tree line, painting the snowfields in a washed-out gray. Mechanics in quilted jackets move like ghosts in the cold, checking panel seams, tightening fuel lines, tapping each rivet as if listening for a hidden defect. The winter wind carries the smell of kerosene and scorched rubber. And at the center of it all, the little red ladder. A single mechanic steadies it as Major Ivan T. Kozhedub, already a living legend with 62 confirmed kills, climbs toward the cockpit of a shape that still doesn't seem real to him. The airframe feels alien, smooth, barely interrupted by drag-producing protuberances. Nothing like the yak fighters he mastered in the Great Patriotic War. He slides open the canopy, the metal shrieking slightly in the cold. Inside his flight jacket pocket rests a small notebook. He writes quickly before the cockpit heater fogs the pencil. December 1st, first operational test, no analog from wartime experience, engine slow to spool, power at altitude impossible to judge, controls feel foreign, but speed, God help us, the speed promised by the engineers is unlike anything we knew over Germany. He snaps the notebook shut as engineers gather below, staring up at him with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. They've bet their lives and reputations on this machine. The jet engine has become a race, not between pilots, but between entire civilizations. The ground marshal waves two orange paddles. Kozhedub lowers the canopy. The engine coughs once, twice, then roars to life. The snow begins to blow sideways under the force of the exhaust as the aircraft shudders, hungry to run. In the distance, the frozen birch trees bend under the thrust as the prototype creeps forward. Within seconds, the MiG-15 is airborne, climbing like a rocket into the pale sky. What no one on the ground fully grasps yet is this. This moment, this exact takeoff, will trigger the deepest strategic panic NATO has felt since its creation. Because the jet screaming over Ramenskoye is not just another aircraft. It is the first swallow of a storm coming from the east. And NATO is not prepared. The war is over, but the machinery of war has not stopped. Across Europe, factories once devoted to tanks and bombers are being retooled for cars and refrigerators. But in two countries, the engines of military aviation grind louder than ever. The United States, flush with money, mass production, and engineering talent. The Soviet Union, hungry, wounded, but driven by an ideological certainty more intense than before. The U.S. ends the war with over 300,000 aircraft produced, thousands of pilots trained, and hundreds of test fields in operation. The USSR ends the war having lost more than 34,000 aircraft in combat, but with combat experience unmatched by any air force in history. And now, both sides know one truth. Whoever controls the sky in the 1950s will control the world. Jet engines, once experimental curiosities, have become the next battlefield. And yet, in 1945, the USSR is behind. Their early jet attempts, the Yak-15 and MiG-9, are little more than piston aircraft bodies with jet engines awkwardly crammed inside. They can barely match American P-80s, let alone surpass them. Stalin wants a miracle. He demands one, and the miracle arrives in the most unexpected form. In 1945, Soviet trophy teams sweep across defeated Germany. Their mission: seize every document, component, blueprint, half-built prototype, and engineer they can find. Among their greatest prizes, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Soviets do not kid themselves. They know their own jet program lags years behind. But the Me-262 is not just a jet. It is a philosophy, a doctrine of speed, sweep, and thrust, unmatched by anything the Allies built during the war. And sitting in a dusty warehouse outside Prague, they find something else. The BMW Euro 3 and Junkers Jumo 004 engines, prototypes, variants, and incomplete production lines. Within weeks, Soviet engineers swarm over them. Study everything, Stalin orders, and build something better. The design bureaus compete: Mikoyan, Gurevich, Sukhoi, Lavochkin. They fight not just for contracts but for survival. A failed prototype can mean exile or worse. And then, in 1946, a breakthrough. Britain, in an extraordinary and historically baffling decision, sells the Soviets 55 Rolls-Royce Nene jet engines. Stalin laughs. What fools! We will copy these without their permission. Within months, Soviet engineers replicate the engine exactly, down to bolt spacing and metallurgy, and designate it the RD-45. This engine will power a jet that changes the balance of the sky. NATO starts to panic. By early 1948, American intelligence begins hearing rumors. Soviet jet tests at Ramenskoye. High-altitude speeds exceeding 950 km/h. Climb rate exceeding anything in Western Europe. New swept-wing design. U.S. analysts are skeptical at first. The Soviets were struggling with piston engines just a few years earlier, but the numbers cannot be ignored. Projected specs. Early NATO estimate 1948. Max speed 1050 km/h. Service ceiling 15,000 men. Rate of climb 50 ANNES. Armament 23 mm Spalps 37 mm cannons. Acceleration unprecedented. These numbers are not just impressive. They suggest superiority over the American F-80 Shooting Star and even threaten the more advanced F-86 Sabre, still in development. A memo circulates through the Pentagon. If accurate, this aircraft represents the most serious threat to Western air power since the Me-262. Across Europe, NATO radar operators begin detecting odd blips at altitudes their aircraft cannot reach. Something is moving fast. Very fast, across the Iron Curtain. But no one in the West has yet seen the aircraft clearly. That will change in 1950, violently, and the skies over Korea will become the crucible in which the myth of Western air superiority is shattered. Inside the Soviet design machine, 1946 to 1948. By the winter of 1946, the Soviet aircraft industry is a battlefield of its own. Unlike in the United States, where competition between firms is tempered by budget cycles and congressional oversight, Soviet design bureaus fight with a desperate, almost existential ferocity. A failed project can mean the end of a career or a quiet disappearance into the administrative shadows. At the center of this struggle stand two men. Artem Mikoyan, the designer with a politician's instincts and a surgeon's precision. Mikhail Gurevich, the quiet mathematician obsessed with airflow, drag coefficients, and the elegant tyranny of equations. Together, they lead OKB-155, the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau. They have something their rivals in the USSR lack, a vision, not a German jet, not a Russian copy, but a Soviet jet, shaped by the brutal lessons of the Eastern Front and the ideological weight of a superpower rising from rubble. Their working philosophy is pinned on a chalkboard in their Moscow office. Speed is life, climb is survival, simplicity is victory. And their calculations repeat the same truth. The jet engine is only half the equation. The wing is the other half. And here, the Soviets make a decision that will shock the world. A German idea, reborn in Soviet hands. In the suburbs of Moscow, in a warehouse stacked with German crate after German crate, Soviet engineers pore over seized Luftwaffe research reports. Among the documents marked Geheimkommandosake, top secret, is a simple diagram showing airflow separation at high subsonic speeds. The Germans discovered something profound late in the war. A wing swept at 35 degrees delays the onset of compressibility effects, effectively raising the aircraft's critical Mach number. This meant less drag at high speed, more stability near transonic velocities, better dive performance, greater energy retention in vertical maneuvers. The Soviet engineers understand immediately. This is the key to competing with the West. But a wing is not enough. They need an engine that can push the aircraft into that new regime. And that is where the Rolls-Royce Nene enters the story. In October 1946, a delegation of Soviet engineers visits Rolls-Royce in England. To the astonishment of the British team, the Soviets asked to purchase several state-of-the-art Nene and Derwent jet engines. Even more astonishingly, the British government approves the sale, believing that the Soviets lacked the industrial base to reverse engineer them effectively. They could not have been more wrong. The NEN becomes the basis for the RD-45, copied so precisely that Rolls-Royce engineers later joke, "They even copied our machining mistakes." The RD-45 produces 22.2 kN of thrust, nearly double what early German turbojets achieved in their wartime prototypes. A swept wing, a powerful engine, a fuselage designed around simplicity and mass production. The ingredients are in place. All that remains is to combine them. In January 1947, OKB-155 produces the first full-scale wooden mock-up of their new fighter. It is short, stubby, almost rude in its proportions, a bulldog of an aircraft with a wide air intake swallowing the entire nose. The cockpit sits high, granting excellent visibility. The wings are angled back at 35 degrees like the blades of a Siberian scythe. Gurevich walks around the mock-up, running his gloved hand along the leading edge. He whispers to an assistant, "It will turn like nothing else and climb like a homesick angel." The airframe is designed around one core concept: energy fighting. Climb fast, dive fast, dictate the fight, and above all, be simple enough to build by the thousands. Where American engineers obsess over hydraulics, electrical systems, and pressurized cockpits, the Soviets focus on mechanical controls, rugged airframes, easy maintenance, cold weather reliability, field repairability. A U.S. intelligence officer will later write, "The MiG-15 looked crude compared to American aircraft until you tried to fight it." How the USSR mass-produced the jet in poverty. The Soviet Union of 1947 is a nation surviving on rations. Millions are homeless. Rail networks shattered by war are still being rebuilt. Entire cities, Stalingrad, Sevastopol, Smolensk, lie broken. And yet, in this landscape of scarcity, a miracle is underway. Soviet aviation plants are retooled at breakneck speed. Lines once producing Yak-9s and LA-5s now churn out fuselages made of lightweight alloys imported through a supply chain that stretches from the Urals to the Baltic. Production statistics begin to rise like a fever. 1948, 30 prototypes. 1949, 300 units. 1950, over 1,300 MiG-15s produced. 1951, more than 3,000 units. This pace shocks Western analysts. How can a country struggling to feed its population build jets like this? The answer lies in Soviet doctrine. Mass production is a weapon. Quantity has a quality all its own. Where the U.S. emphasizes refinement and avionics, the USSR emphasizes output. Where the U.S. builds for comfort and ergonomics, the USSR builds for the battlefield. Why NATO pilots will soon call it a flying artillery piece. American jets in 1949 typically carry 6x 50 caliber Browning machine guns or 4x 20 mm cannons in newer designs. The MiG-15 carries something vastly more dangerous: 1x 37 mm Nudelman N-37 cannon, 2x 23 mm NS-23 cannons. This armament is designed not for dogfighting, but for killing bombers. One hit from the 37 mm can shatter a B-29's wing spar. 2 hits can split the aircraft in half. This terrifies NATO planners because the Strategic Air Command is premised on nuclear-capable bombers penetrating Soviet airspace. Now, staring at gun camera footage, analysts whisper, "If these guns reach our bombers before we reach Soviet targets, everything changes." The MiG-15 is shaping into not just a fighter, but a strategic threat. By mid-1947, test pilots gather at Ramenskoye. The conditions are brutal, wind chills reaching 30-degree C, fuel trucks freezing overnight, maintenance crews warming their hands over engine exhausts. The pilots who climb into the new aircraft include aces from the Great Patriotic War, men who fought over Kursk, Stalingrad, and Berlin, men who survived dogfights against Bf-109s, FW-190s, and He-162s. Their first impressions are written in diaries. Feels like a cannon strapped to a rocket. At 10,000 meters, throttle response is delayed, but once it bites, the climb is unimaginable. The wings hum when pushing near Mach, not flutter, a warning. Roll rate stiffens, elevator feels heavy, she wants to go straight up. And one note that becomes iconic: this aircraft is not for the inexperienced. It will kill fools. The Soviet Air Force understands immediately. They have built something dangerous, something that demands respect, something the West has no answer to, not yet. NATO's first clear warning, the 1948 Baltic Incident. On the morning of March 27, 1948, a Swedish reconnaissance DC-3, flying a routine signals intelligence mission over the Baltic, suddenly picks up a radar return climbing fast from the Soviet side. The Swedish crew watches their altimeter spin upward. Another blip appears behind them. It closes the distance in seconds. The crew never sees the jet clearly, just a silver streak passing their right wingtip, leaving turbulence so violent the DC-3 nearly flips. Months later, NATO analysts identify the aircraft based on climb rate and speed, a MiG-15 prototype. The alarm bells begin ringing. Radar crews in Denmark and Norway report high-altitude passes they cannot match. U.S. pilots stationed in Europe report silver arrows vanishing into cloud cover at impossible angles. By early 1950, NATO's intelligence estimates are no longer conservative. They are frightened, and they are right to be. Within months, the MiG-15 will appear over the Yalu River in Korea, and the West will understand what the Soviet Union has built. This is no longer just an experiment. It is a machine designed to challenge the United States for control of the air. The MiG-15's arrival in Korea begins without fanfare, without announcement, and without any acknowledgement from Moscow. The first confirmed sighting occurs on November 1950, when U.S. pilots flying F-51 Mustangs over the Yalu River report silver-swept-wing jets climbing toward them almost vertically, leaving vapor spirals in the brittle autumn sky. The Americans cannot believe the altitude these aircraft are reaching so quickly. Their piston engines wheeze for oxygen, while the strangers surge upward effortlessly. One Mustang pilot radios breathless, "Whatever that thing is, it's not Chinese, not North Korean, that's Soviet." The Air Force intelligence officers listening at Itazuke Air Base in Japan exchange alarmed looks. They know the Soviets officially are not flying combat missions. They know no Asian nation has the industrial base to produce a jet of this scale. And they know this means something else. The Cold War has just entered the sky. 2 days later, the unmistakable signature of the MiG-15 appears again, this time diving on a formation of B-29 superfortresses heading toward bridges on the Yalu. The bomber crews watch in disbelief as a single silver dart streaks past them, fires 2 short bursts, and then accelerates up and away before their gunners can even swing their turrets into position. Back at the base, engineers inspect the shattered wing spar of one returning B-29. A single 37mm shell has ripped through the main structure. They measure the hole silently, aware that 1 degree of angle or half a meter difference would have brought down the aircraft. A colonel summarizes the mood bluntly. "We've never seen anything like this gun package." That night, American planners elevate every priority. The Korean War is no longer a conventional conflict on the ground. It is now a test of aviation systems, industrial capability, and doctrinal evolution. And the Soviets, even without admitting their involvement, have thrown their best fighter into the ring. Across the Yalu, in the safe haven of Antung Airfield, the Soviet presence is unmistakable. Trucks unload maintenance crates stamped with Cyrillic lettering. Russian ground crews wear standard-issue winter jackets. Pilots converse in a mix of Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Moscow accents. Officially, they are Chinese volunteers. Unofficially, they treat the entire operation as a proving ground. On a cold evening flight briefing, a Soviet regiment commander named Colonel Alexander Kumenichkin stands in front of his pilots. A stenographer records the briefing, and the transcript survives. "Your aircraft outruns every American machine. Your climb rate defeats them. Your cannon kills their bombers. But listen to me. They will adapt. They always adapt. Do not underestimate them." He taps the chalkboard where someone has drawn the profile of an American jet still in development, the F-86 Sabre. Kumenichkin circles the swept wing. His message is clear. The Americans are learning. The real showdown begins less than 2 weeks later. On December 17, 1950, an F-86 Sabre patrol encounters MiG-15s for the first time. The engagement is short, vertical, and blisteringly fast. Gun cameras from the Sabres record the surreal moment when the MiG-15 seems to float upward, climbing through thin air as if freed from the constraints of gravity. The Americans pursue, but their aircraft begin to buffet at high transonic speeds where the MiG remains smooth. One Sabre pilot mutters over the radio, "This thing, this MiG, it's a monster." Yet the Sabres fight fiercely. Their 50 caliber machine guns spit lines of white tracer. One MiG takes hits and spirals downward, trailing smoke. The pilot ejects near the Yalu, parachuting into friendly territory. A captured Soviet diary entry, later translated by U.S. intelligence, reflects on this first major duel. They fight with enormous courage. They are not afraid to climb with us or dive with us. Their aircraft is steady in a dive, perhaps steadier than ours. But at altitude, in the vertical, we rule the sky. Indeed, for the first months of the air war, Soviet pilots exploit their advantages ruthlessly. Their commanders teach a simple doctrine: fight in the vertical, not the horizontal. Zoom climbs, slashing passes, short bursts of cannon fire. Never turn with the Americans, never get slow. The statistics from early 1951 tell a stark story. In several engagements, MiG units achieve a kill ratio exceeding 5.1 against older U.S. aircraft, especially F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets. American planners begin phasing out these jets from frontline roles, shifting the burden to the Sabres. NATO, meanwhile, studies every scrap of information arriving from Korea. British analysts scrutinize gun camera footage frame by frame. French engineers calculate turn radii, wing loading, and energy retention. Norwegian radar operators measure the climb rates of unidentified high-altitude aircraft crossing near their airspace. A secret report delivered to the Pentagon in April 1951 reads, "The rate of climb observed in Korea suggests a thrust-to-weight ratio not previously achieved by Soviet design bureaus. The only comparable Western prototypes exist on drawing boards or test stands. We must assume the Soviets have achieved mass production of advanced turbojets." This estimate is wrong. The Soviets have not overcome all engineering hurdles. Their engines suffer from limited service life, sometimes as low as 25 operating hours before requiring overhaul. Their airframes demand constant adjustment of wing screws and panel seams. But this does not matter on the battlefield. What matters is the vertical. What matters is altitude. What matters is energy. The MiG-15 controls all three. And in the psychological arena, the impact is even more profound. NATO pilots brief before missions under a cloud of tension. They memorize escape dives, throttle recovery procedures, and the ominous boundaries of their own flight envelopes. The maximum Mach numbers beyond which the Sabre trembles and threatens to shed its wings. In one briefing transcript from an F-86 squadron, "If you see him climbing, don't follow. You'll black out before he does. Keep your speed, keep your dive. Fight where your machine is strongest. The roll rate, the low-altitude turn." The pilots nod but remain unconvinced. The MiG-15's reputation is growing into something larger than metal and gasoline. It is becoming myth, a creature of raw climb and cold altitude, a silver predator waiting above the Yalu. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Design Bureau celebrates test reports from Korea with quiet satisfaction. They know the limits of their aircraft better than NATO does. They know it compresses at high speeds. They know roll authority stiffens dangerously near Mach 0.92. They know inexperienced pilots can rip the wings off in too aggressive dives. But they also know that none of this matters if they can dictate the engagement. Speed kills, altitude kills, climb kills, and the MiG holds all three. By mid-1951, the air war intensifies. Bombers once considered untouchable now require entire fighter groups for escort. On June 10th, a formation of B-29s suffers catastrophic losses, torn apart by synchronized attacks from Soviet-flown MiGs. The superfortresses lose 3 aircraft in minutes, and one limps home riddled with holes the size of fists. A shaken U.S. analyst writes in a report, "If these guns reach our nuclear-capable platforms over Europe, the strategic balance collapses." This is the moment NATO understands the truth. The MiG-15 is not just a battlefield weapon, it is a geopolitical lever, a fighter that threatens the doctrine of strategic bombing, a fighter that challenges assumptions about Soviet industry, a fighter that changes intelligence estimates of Soviet engineering capacity, a fighter that forces the West to rethink everything. In airfields across Europe, NATO pilots rehearse emergency climbs, split S reversals, and high G elevator pulls. Engineers work under fluorescent lights, reverse engineering every scrap of data they can gather. And intelligence officers begin whispering a new, uncomfortable phrase: air superiority is no longer guaranteed. In the cockpit of a MiG climbing over the Yalu, the altimeter spins upward. In the cockpit of a Sabre diving to escape, needles tremble at the edge of compressibility. In war rooms from Washington to London, maps are redrawn and doctrines revised. The Soviet jet has not merely entered the battlefield, it has entered the Western imagination. Everything from here will escalate. And the next phase will determine whether NATO can claw back control or whether the skies belong to the East. The roar of the MiG-15 over Korea is only the visible tip of a vast machine of industry and logistics, an industrial civilization rebuilt from ruins and forced into overdrive by ideological urgency, geopolitical paranoia, and the raw mathematics of survival. The aircraft that terrifies NATO in the skies is not simply a triumph of aerodynamics. It is the culmination of a logistical system stretched across 11 time zones, powered by a command economy that willingly starves luxuries so that aluminum and kerosene may flow into factories instead. American analysts in 1951 understand this only dimly. They see the jet, they do not yet see the system that produced it. But inside the Soviet Union, the miracle is not the aircraft itself. The miracle is mass production. In the months after the MiG-15's debut in Korea, Western intelligence estimates struggle to determine how many have been built. The CIA suggests 500. British Air Ministry intelligence suggests no more than 700, but internal Soviet records later reveal the truth. By mid-1951, the USSR has already produced more than 3,000 MiG-15s, with monthly outputs occasionally exceeding 250 aircraft. Factories in Kuibyshev, Novosibirsk, Gorky, and Tbilisi run 3 shifts a day, 6 days a week. Workers sleep in barracks beside the assembly halls. Food is still rationed in some regions, yet the lines for aircraft components remain uninterrupted. Metallurgy plants in the Urals pour ingots of aluminum alloy hauled from mines thousands of miles east. Railroad cars creak under the weight of fuselage sections, wings, ammunition pallets, and engine components. The Soviet economy bends itself toward one goal: feeding the sky. Alongside production, there is the logistical chain, far less glamorous than the sleek fighter itself, but more decisive than any dogfight. Jet aircraft are hungry machines. They devour fuel, tires, brake pads, and engine hours at a rate conventional piston fighters never approached. The MiG's RD-45 turbojet consumes 1.37 kilograms of kerosene per second at full thrust. A single training day for a Soviet regiment can burn through 90 metric tons of fuel. This burden stretches the Soviet rail network to its limits. Tanker cars clatter from refineries near Baku to airfields in the Far East. Winter freezes oil in the pipes. Workers beat fuel drums with hammers to crack the ice. Snowplows clear runways nightly. Maintenance teams warm engines with charcoal braziers in the bitter dawn hours. Every hour in the air requires 12 hours of groundwork. Every minute of combat requires tons of logistical support. This is the secret NATO initially misses. Even in poverty, the Soviet Union can sustain high-intensity air operations because its economic system has been built for decades to prioritize heavy industry over consumer goods. A captured Soviet mechanic, interviewed in 1953, explains it simply. "We did not have refrigerators or good shoes, but we had aircraft. This was our mathematics." Inside the NATO councils, analysts begin to map these logistics. They study railroad timetables, estimate refinery outputs, and cross-reference rumors from East German defectors. When they see the numbers, they do not smile. The Soviets may be poor, but they are organized. They may be hungry, but they are efficient. They may lack abundance, but they excel in concentration. The MiG-15 is the physical embodiment of this system, a machine built not for comfort, but for production and combat. And yet, paradoxically, the Soviet model that fuels the MiG's success contains the seeds of its eventual weakness. Western pilots describe the MiG cockpit as cramped, poorly heated, with minimal instrumentation and sparse ergonomics. The oxygen system is finicky, the gun sight primitive compared to American standards. The aircraft lacks the avionic sophistication of the F-86 Sabre. Its radar rangefinder is basic, and its electrical system prone to erratic behavior in damp weather. But these shortcomings are part of the design philosophy. Everything unnecessary has been stripped away. Where the U.S. sees value in electronics, the USSR sees a liability. Where the U.S. sees pilot comfort as a path to combat efficiency, the USSR sees it as indulgence. The Red Air Force wants aircraft that can be built fast, repaired quickly, operated by average pilots, flown from mediocre airfields, maintained by minimally trained ground crews. The MiG-15's landing gear is rugged and widely spaced, ideal for the rough runways of Manchuria. Its engine is simple to remove, 4 bolts and the entire unit slides out. Its guns are easy to clean, its panels easy to replace. This is where the MiG becomes more than a machine. It becomes an instrument of ideology. Soviet leadership believes in the power of the collective over the individual. An aircraft designed to require elite pilots would contradict the doctrine. So they build a fighter that can be flown by many and produced by thousands. The Americans note this with unease. Their own system produces superb aircraft, but at a cost of complexity, price, and training time. Many Western jets rely on delicate avionics and maintenance-intensive engines. The F-86 Sabre is a masterpiece, but it is also a luxury item compared to the MiG. The industrial contrast becomes clearer in 1951 when a damaged MiG crashes almost intact in South Korea. American engineers swarm the wreckage. They note the welding, rough but solid, the alloys, crude but resilient, the construction philosophy, simplicity itself, and the wing, swept to perfection. The chief Air Force analyst writes, "This is not a poor country's aircraft. This is a ruthless country's aircraft." Meanwhile, Soviet pilots are instructed to think not of individual skill, but of collective tactics, fluid groups, vertical maneuvers, coordinated slashing dives. The MiG thrives in these energy fights, where the speed of thought matters less than the speed of climb. But behind every sortie is a hidden war of logistics. A MiG regiment requires 50 tons of kerosene daily, 700 man-hours of maintenance, constant supply of 23mm and 37mm ammunition, replacement tires every 15-20 landings, engine overhauls every 25-30 flight hours, rail shipments of spare parts every 48 hours. To outsiders, this seems unsustainable. Yet the Soviet Union has practiced this mode of war for decades. The Red Army's strength in Front was never elegance. It was on throughput. The same system that produced T-34 tanks by the tens of thousands now produces MiG-15s. The factories that once poured out artillery shells now pour out fuselage ribs and wing spars. The workers who once built Katyusha rocket rails now assemble N-37 cannons. The country that starved its consumer sector to feed its war machine now starves peacetime comforts to feed its jets. This asymmetry terrifies NATO planners because it suggests something profound. If the Cold War turns hot, the USSR can flood the skies. Even if Western aircraft are more refined, more comfortable, more technologically advanced, the Soviets can bury the skies under numbers. By 1952, the MiG-15 no longer represents a shock. It represents a system, an integrated machine of labor, ideology, and industry that can outproduce nearly any rival. But the West is not passive. The West studies. The West adapts. American industry begins shifting toward mass-producing jets with modular parts, simplified maintenance procedures, and streamlined production lines. The lessons of the MiG force changes that will ripple through NATO air doctrine for decades. Yet at this moment in the early 1950s, one fact is inescapable. The MiG-15 is not just a fighter, It is the sharp edge of an industrial civilization designed for war. And NATO is only beginning to understand the scale of the challenge. The MiG-15 does not merely challenge NATO's aircraft, it challenges NATO's confidence. By mid-1951, the air war in Korea becomes a crucible in which pilots on both sides confront something deeper than metal and velocity. They confront themselves, their beliefs about superiority, training, and the very nature of technological progress. The MiG-15's sleek silver form slices through doctrine as sharply as it cuts through cold air. For NATO pilots, the first shock is not the speed, it is not the cannon, it is not even the climb rate, it is the feeling of being hunted. An American Sabre pilot, Lieutenant James Harper, writes after his first encounter, "They appeared out of the high sun like ghosts. We would lose the advantage before we knew the fight had begun. It was psychological more than anything, a sense that they owned the vertical." Owning the vertical is more than a tactical phrase, it is a psychological territory. Whoever commands altitude commands initiative. Whoever commands initiative commands the mind of the opponent. In the mess halls and briefing tents along the Korean peninsula, Sabre pilots trade stories with a mixture of bravado and unease. They know they can beat the MiG in the right conditions. They know the Sabre's roll rate, low-altitude handling, and dive performance can balance the scales. But the MiG looms in their imaginations nevertheless, silent, cold, and always above. To counter this, American commanders reorient training. They emphasize shallow climbing spirals, low-altitude, high-speed merges, rolling scissors maneuvers, overshoot, traps, aggressive dive recoveries. The F-86 Sabre becomes more than a machine. It becomes a statement that American design philosophy can answer Soviet innovation. Yet beyond the dogfights, there is another layer, the ideological battlefield. Soviet pilots flying from Antung are told they are participating in a decisive struggle against imperialism, but their diaries reveal more nuanced reflections. One MiG pilot writes, "The Americans fight well, they are brave, their aircraft is beautiful, I admire it, I do not write this aloud." Another note, written in pencil smudged by cold fingers. "When I fire, I feel nothing ideological, only fear and then focus." These private entries are not weakness, they are humanity. Men on both sides, trained to see each other as symbols, begin to see each other as pilots, skilled, frightened, determined pilots. The Americans, too, experience moments of dissonance. A Sabre pilot records, "We knew they were Russians long before the official reports admitted it. The radio discipline gave them away, the accents, but their skill, that was unmistakable." Skill is not just an advantage. It is a crack in the wall of propaganda. In Washington and London, analysts struggle to reconcile two competing truths. The Soviet Union is economically strained, its cities scarred by war, its consumer goods sector starving. And yet, its pilots and engineers have produced a jet that can stand toe-to-toe with America's best. This contradiction slowly erodes a long-held assumption that economic abundance alone guarantees technological superiority. The Soviet Union, though deprived of luxuries, has concentrated its resources with relentless focus. This realization breeds fear not only in pilots, but in policymakers. If the Soviets can produce this jet under hardship, what could they produce under prosperity? If they can outclimb American fighters, could they one day outproduce American factories? This fear becomes a quiet drumbeat beneath the Cold War. Meanwhile, in the skies over the Yalu, the psychological war intensifies. MiG pilots become bolder, diving into Sabre formations with the confidence of altitude supremacy. American pilots counter with aggressive energy tactics, low-level merges, high-speed dives where the Sabre's handling shines. One combat report from 1951 captures the shift in tone. "We no longer fear them, we respect them, and that is more important." Respect is the beginning of adaptation. Adaptation is the beginning of victory. By late 1952, the psychological balance begins to shift. American pilots gain experience, training regimens evolve. Sabre squadrons learned the MiG's weaknesses, its dangerous compressibility behavior at high speed, its stiffening controls, its tendency to pitch up violently during hard turns at transonic velocities. They develop a doctrine. Don't climb with the MiG. Don't chase into the vertical. Force horizontal merges. Use speed, not altitude. Avoid cannon range. Stay below Mach 0.92 until the break. They fight the MiG not where it is strongest, but where it is merely human. Slowly, confidence returns to the Sabre wings. Slowly, gun camera footage begins to tilt in their favor. Slowly, the ratio shifts. Not crushing dominance, not yet, but equilibrium. And equilibrium in a psychological war is its own victory. Inside Soviet cockpits, doubts appear. A MiG pilot writes late in the war, "The Americans have learned. They always learn. Their roll rate is infernal. I feel their aircraft turning beneath me." This is not propaganda. It is fear, written in the quiet moments between missions. By 1953, the psychological battle has become symmetrical. Both sides respect each other. Both sides fear each other. Both sides adapt. And in the halls of NATO command, another fear emerges, not of the MiG alone, but of the industrial and ideological engine that produced it. If the Soviet Union can match American engineering in the air, can it also match American industrial output on the ground? Can it build not just hundreds but thousands of jets? Can it contest the skies over Europe? Can it threaten the bomber fleets that form the backbone of Western nuclear strategy? The answers to these questions will define NATO policy, procurement, manufacturing priorities, and pilot training programs for decades. The MiG-15 has forced the Western mind into a new shape, one that understands Soviet capability not as an abstract ideology, but as a concrete, powerful reality. The psychological war is no longer confined to pilots in the cockpit. It is now waged in factories, war rooms, and diplomatic corridors, and beneath it all lies a question that haunts both sides. If this is the beginning, what will come next? In the final year of the Korean War, the shock of the MiG-15 begins to radiate outward, away from the Yalu River, away from the frozen flight lines of Antung and Kimpo, and into the deeper structures of global power. A fighter aircraft has become a hinge on which strategies, economies, and ideologies shift. For NATO, the MiG is no longer a machine. It is an alarm bell. The air war reveals something Western planners had not expected. The Soviet Union can wield technological surprise. It can produce an aircraft that forces rapid adaptation. It can disrupt assumptions built from the experience of World War II, where American industry outpaced all rivals, and American skies belonged to bombers escorted by swarms of fighters. The MiG-15 does something subtle but profound. It reveals the Soviet Union as a peer competitor in the air and potentially beyond the air. Its climb, its guns, its altitude performance confront NATO with a sudden disorienting truth. The next war, if it comes, will not begin with slow escalation. It will begin with jets screaming across borders at transonic speeds. This realization triggers two reactions within NATO: panic and idea, reinvention. In Washington, procurement officers revised the Air Force's 5-year plan in a single night. Engineers work with slide rules under fluorescent lamps at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, calculating wing sweep angles, engine thrust curves, and structural tolerances for new prototypes. The Sabre, excellent though it is, becomes only the starting point. Designs for the F-100 Super Sabre, F-102 Delta Dagger, and British Hawker Hunter accelerate. The MiG-15 becomes the reference, the test case, the adversary in every simulation. Production quotas rise, budgets swell. A new phrase enters the bureaucratic language of NATO: fighter gap. But doctrine changes as much as hardware. The MiG teaches NATO the same lesson the P-47 and P-51 once taught the Luftwaffe. Altitude is strategy. Climb rate is deterrence. Acceleration is diplomacy. Air superiority is not won with numbers alone, but with the ability to choose the terms of engagement. This lesson echoes especially strongly in Britain, where the memory of the Battle of Britain still shapes the political imagination. RAF analysts warn that a fleet of Soviet MiGs deployed from East German bases could challenge British airspace within minutes. Radar operators imagine blips rising in tight vertical formations. The fear is not invasion, it is humiliation. Loss of the sky, the vulnerability of cities. NATO begins drilling for these scenarios. Radar technicians rehearse rapid identification. Pilots practice high-G intercepts. Command centers rewrite alert procedures. And engineers design new oxygen systems to support the brutal altitudes where MiG combat thrives. But the MiG's influence extends even further into economics and ideology. The Soviet Union, though victorious in the air, reveals something curious through its success. An economy bent so extremely toward military output that consumer life suffers. American analysts studying captured logbooks, pilot letters, and maintenance protocols notice the same pattern. The USSR is capable of extraordinary industrial concentration, but this concentration comes at a cost. One American economist, writing in a 1954 Rand report, puts it starkly, "They can build fighters, but they cannot build refrigerators." This is not mockery, it is a strategic observation. Where the MiG-15 demonstrates Soviet strength, everyday life behind the Iron Curtain reveals Soviet fragility. This contrast becomes a powerful tool in NATO's ideological campaign. In West Germany, where fear of Soviet expansion is acute, American troops hand out chocolate bars to children during training exercises. In Japan, air bases become showcases of consumer abundance. Ice cream machines, soda fountains, PX stores bursting with goods. The psychological war does not end when pilots land. It continues on streets, in canteens, in supermarkets where former enemies see shelves filled to excess. The MiG-15 helps trigger another extraordinary process, the rebuilding of Western Europe through American aid. The message of the Marshall Plan becomes tied, implicitly, to the message of the MiG threat. If Europe is strong and prosperous, Soviet influence weakens. If Europe is weak and frightened, the MiG's shadow grows. And so, across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, construction cranes rise, highways expand, rail hubs modernize, new factories open. The same logistic and industrial logic that powers American victory in World War II now powers the reconstruction of the free world. Behind this economic surge lies an unspoken calculation. To counter a centrally planned military behemoth, the democracies must prove that abundance, freedom, and modernity produce superior power, not through slogans, but through refrigerators, cars, radios, and supermarkets. Food becomes ideology. Coca-Cola becomes a symbol of stability. Ice cream, astonishingly, becomes a diplomatic advantage. American bases in Europe install ice cream machines, not merely for troop morale, but as an unintentional demonstration of system-level superiority. Visitors from newly reformed West German ministries marvel at the electrical infrastructure required to keep such devices running continuously, an infrastructure still damaged or absent in many regions. The MiG-15, therefore, fuels not only NATO's military modernization, but also the West's economic and ideological confidence. To counter Soviet industrial might, the West doubles down on consumer delight. Where the MiG soars on kerosene, NATO soars on calories, comfort, and choice. Yet the Soviet Union is not blind to this dynamic. In Moscow, a quiet introspection begins. The party celebrates the MiG's triumphs, but planners know they are confronting a paradox. They can build remarkable weaponry, but they cannot yet match Western living standards. They can command medals for jets, but they cannot produce enough butter. They can sweep the skies, but they cannot fill the shops. This tension becomes visible in letters from Soviet pilots stationed near the Chinese-Korean border. One writes, "We win in the air." But when I see the Americans' camps, their food, their heat, their equipment, I understand another truth. They live as if the war is far away. We live as if the war is always here. This is not dissent. It is disillusionment, a subtle shift in belief that mirrors what German POWs once experienced in America's train cars, kitchens, and classrooms. The idea that abundance, real abundance, undermines ideology more effectively than any leaflet. And so, when the armistice begins to loom in 1953, the world is already changed. The MiG-15 has altered procurement, doctrine, industrial strategy, political economy, and global psychology. It has forced NATO into a period of frantic modernization, and it has revealed the limits of Soviet central planning. What remains is the long-term legacy, a legacy that will be explored fully in the concluding part. The jet that terrified. NATO has done more than shape a battlefield. It has shaped a world. The armistice of July 1953 ends the shooting in Korea, but it does not end the war the MiG-15 has begun. The silver jet that screamed over the Yalu becomes more than a weapon. It becomes a symbol woven into every subsequent chapter of the Cold War. For NATO, for the Soviet Union, for the pilots who fought, and for the engineers who dreamed in equations and rivets, the MiG is not simply an aircraft. It is a reminder that technology can surprise, a reminder that doctrine must evolve, a reminder that industrial capacity shapes geopolitics as surely as guns and jets, and for many, a reminder that the ideological contest between East and West is not decided solely in the skies, but in the homes, stores, factories, fields, and daily lives of each system's people. When the guns fall silent, the first post-war analyses begin. American air intelligence teams scour battle reports, gun camera footage, and testimonies from Sabre pilots. Their conclusion is cautiously triumphant. The F-86 holds a slight tactical edge in experienced hands, but experience is the key. When both aircraft are flown near the limits of their envelopes, the outcome depends less on machinery and more on the man in the cockpit. A classified USAF review in late 1953 states, "The MiG-15 is not a mysterious beast. It is a highly capable, ruthlessly optimized platform. Its capabilities derive from clarity of purpose, not extravagance of design." Clarity of purpose. This phrase becomes the touchstone for NATO's next generation of fighters. The MiG's influence ripples into design boards from Seattle to Farnborough. Western engineers internalize the lessons. They study the MiG's 23-degree wing torsion, the 35-degree sweep, its low wing loading, its structural tolerances. They note where the Soviets chose simplicity over sophistication, the hydraulic lines, the minimal avionics, the mechanical gun chargers, the rugged undercarriage. And above all, they marvel at the sheer economy of the design. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is extra. Every gram of weight serves performance or production. This philosophy, alien to peacetime democracies, forces the West to rethink the relationship between abundance and efficiency. To build aircraft at scale, to maintain them in harsh climates, to deploy them rapidly, these insights return as doctrine. But the most lasting legacy emerges not in factories or hangars, but in the minds of pilots. For Soviet pilots, Korea leaves a contradictory impression. They fly one of the world's greatest fighters, yet return home to ration books and empty store shelves. They sit in briefings, praising Soviet technological prowess, yet whisper in private about American consumer goods, cockpits warmer, seats softer, food richer. One pilot's post-war memoir, smuggled into the West decades later, reads, "In the sky, we were equals. On the ground, we were not." It is strange to admire your rival's comfort while trying to kill him. It is a sentence only war can produce, equal parts pride, respect, fear, and melancholy. For American pilots, Korea becomes a crucible of humility. The supremacy they inherited from World War II evaporates in the cold air above the Yalu. They learn again what their predecessors learned over Tunisia and New Guinea. The enemy adapts, the enemy innovates, and the enemy cannot be underestimated. One Sabre pilot writes, "The MiG-15 stripped away our arrogance. It forced us to earn the sky again." These reflections echo into NATO planning documents for decades. They shape training regimens, emphasizing adaptability over rigid doctrine. They influence procurement, balancing cutting-edge complexity with the rugged reliability the MiG demonstrated. They even affect the cultural imagination of military aviation, where the MiG-15 becomes the archetype of the enemy fighter. Simple, lethal, cold, elegant in its severity. Yet the deeper consequences unfold only gradually. Throughout the 1950s, Europe undergoes an astonishing transformation. Cities rise from rubble, highways knit nations back together, factories roar to life, this time not to build tanks but tractors, not fighters but refrigerators. The ideological war becomes increasingly a competition of living standards. The Soviet Union continues its emphasis on military production, believing that guns secure borders. The West, having learned from the MiG that raw industrial capacity remains essential, invests heavily not only in armaments but in consumer abundance. Supermarkets, 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 aisles filled with choices, refrigerators filled with choice. It is not a coincidence. Behind every NATO logistics chain lies an implicit assertion: freedom produces abundance. Abundance produces strength. The MiG-15, with all its brilliance, represents a system that achieved excellence through sacrifice. The F-86 Sabre, with all its finesse, represents a system that achieved excellence through prosperity. This contrast, subtle in 1950, becomes glaring by the early 1960s, and then, in a final twist of irony, the MiG-15 becomes the first Soviet aircraft widely exported. It flies in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its image becomes iconic: a silver wing slicing through the dawn, a red star beneath the canopy. It outlives its rivals in service, a testament to the ruggedness of its construction. But inside every cockpit, future pilots, Polish, East German, Chinese, North Korean, learn something their Soviet predecessors never fully articulated. The MiG-15 is a machine built to hold the sky for a moment, not to define the world beneath it. And the world beneath it changes. Factories modernize, nations prosper, economies surge. And by the late 1960s, even the Soviet Union cannot ignore the reality that people crave not merely safety or pride, but comfort. Refrigerators matter. Apartments matter. Lights matter. Choice matters. And slowly, the lesson reverse-engineered from the West becomes unavoidable. An ideology built on scarcity cannot outlast an ideology built on abundance. As the decades slide toward détente, the MiG-15's legend becomes a quieter thing, an echo in hangars, a photograph in an engineering textbook, a glint of metal in a museum. For the pilots who flew it, its memory is sharper: the weight of G-forces pressing into the seat, the glow of the gun sight, the howl of the engines spooling up on a winter morning. For the planners who studied it, the MiG is the hinge that forced NATO to rebuild doctrines and economies alike. But for historians, its true meaning is larger still. The MiG-15 is proof that war is not decided only by courage or technology. It is decided by systems: industrial, logistical, economic, ideological. It is decided by the ability to learn and adapt faster than an opponent can impose his will. It is decided by whether a society can produce not only weapons, but also the comforts and freedoms that sustain morale and legitimacy. And now, at the end of this long story, we return to the winter airfield at Ramenskoye in 1947. The frost still clings to the wings, the sun still lifts itself unwillingly above the horizon, the mechanics still move like shadows in the cold, and Major Ivan Kozhedub still climbs into the cockpit of a machine whose potential even he cannot fully grasp. He closes the canopy. He breathes onto his gloved knuckles. He checks the gauges, primitive but alive. He pushes the throttle and the engine roars. The silver aircraft accelerates across the snow-dusted runway, lifting into the pale sky like a promise or a threat. No one on the ground understands the future that rises with it, not the battles along the Yalu, not the reconstruction of Europe, not the doctrines rewritten, not the economies reborn, not the ideologies transformed. The MiG-15 disappears into the clouds, a shape, a sound, a symbol, and for a moment the airfield is still again. But everything has changed.